Well, welcome back to Reading Sisters. Today, I, Naomi, am going to reading Song for Will by Lion Kelly, which is a Sunshine Save book, which we are going to try to read more of this year for our channel. Now, this is a digital book, a little bit of a change from what we usually do, but change is never a bad thing. Until last summer, I thought the only thing I had in common with that whale on the beach was a name. I sat with Grandpa after collecting shells and driftwood scattered along the shore, and I sat and windflowers from the dunes. The shells and driftwood were for Grandma, and the flowers were for the whale. Grandpa had asked how school was going, and I told him it was the same, which wasn't good. I had been at school for 2 years and still felt like the new kid. Grandpa patted the sand next to him. "Did you know she was probably deaf too?" he signed. I didn't have to ask who he meant. The whale had been buried there for 11 years, and my parents had told me enough times about what happened that day. I shook my head. I hadn't known that, and I didn't know why Grandpa was changing the subject. Maybe he didn't know what to tell me anymore about school. The whale had beached herself the same day I was born. When she was spotted in the shallow waters of the Gulf, some people stood on the shore and watched her approach. My grandma ran into the cold February water and tried to push her away from the sand, as if she could make a 40-ton animal change her mind about where she wanted to go. That was really dangerous. Even though the whale was weak by then, one good whack with the tail flipper could have knocked Grandma out. I don't know what I would have done. Jumped in like she did, or just stood there. She wasn't born deaf like we were, Grandpa continued. The scientists who studied her said it had just happened. Maybe she had been swimming near an explosion from an oil ring or a bomb test. When Grandpa told a story, I saw it as clearly as it were happening right there in front of me. His signing hand showed me the whale in the ocean that suddenly went quiet, swimming over there, over there, over there, trying to find the sounds again. Maybe that was why she'd been there on our Gulf of Mexico, because instead of in deep ocean waters where she belonged, say whales didn't swim so close to the shore. Only her on that day. Um, a whale can't find its way through a world without sound, Grandpa added. The ocean is dark and it covers most of the earth, and whales live in all of it. The sounds guide them through that, and they talk to one another oceans. With the familiar sounds of the ocean gone, the whale was lost in her new silent world. A rescue group came to the beach and tried to save the whale, and they called her Iris. Grandma asked my called her Iris, yeah. Grandma asked my parents to give the name to me, too, since I'd entered the world as the whale was leaving it. After the marine biologist learned all they could from her, she was buried right there on the beach, along with an unanswered question about what had brought her to that shore. We lived on that coast until the summer after second grade, when my family moved to Houston for my dad's new job. Since then, we went back just once or twice a summer. The good thing about our new home was that it was closer to my grandparents. I liked being able to spend more time with them, especially since they were both deaf like me. But we all miss the beach, and I miss being around kids like me. My old school had just a few deaf kids, but that was enough. We had our classes together, and we had one another. But it's different for us, Grandpa signed. Out there, there's more light, and we need it is our own small space to feel at home. Sometimes it takes time to figure things out, but you'll do it. You'll find your way. I wish I'd asked him how long that would take. Chapter 2. I'd come to the conclusion that sending me to the office was Mrs. Collins' only joy in life. That made her responsible for her happiness in a way. But I tried to slip into class without her noticing. I was only a minute late this time, and I had really good reason. She pointed toward the front of the office before I could drop into my chair. When I got back to the room with my charity pass, Mrs. Khan said to my interpreter, Mrs. Charles, tell Iris to move over next to Nina so she can catch her up. She usually talked around me like that. Mr. Charles had told her so many times that she could just talk to me and he would interpret the message instead of always saying, tell Iris. Finally, he gave up reminding her. She was never going to get it. Also, I didn't need help catching up, and for sure I didn't want it from Nina. I'll catch myself up, I signed, and Mr. Charles voiced that to Con. Her face turned even meaner than usual, which I hadn't thought was possible. She didn't say anything else, just jerked a point finger to the space next to Nina's desk. The plan made sense to Mrs. Khan because she thought Nina was the smartest person in the class, and Nina thought she knew sign language. She checked out a library book about it, so that made her an expert. Some people have kind of confidence that lets them get away with being clueless. Nina signed something to me as I slid the desk over to the territory. I asked Mr. Charles, did she just call herself a giant squirrel? He clamped his lips together and looked away while answering, I think she meant great partner. That was what I figured, but trying to make Mr. Charles laugh was one of my favorite things. I leaned over to the next row to look at Clarissa's gold book. Mr. Charles interpreted my question. When I asked Clarissa what we were working on, Nina tried to barge in with her flapping hands and made up sign language. When I ignored her, she got dangerously close to my face, as if I couldn't see her. My eyes stayed on Mr. Charles, since he actually did know what he was doing. Nina's hands were like a swarm of flies I wanted to swat away, so it felt good to flick the wrist of an open hand to sign stop to her. After Mr. Charles interpreted that, he added that it might be a distraction to have two people signing at the same time. Usually he didn't jump in like that because he wanted me to take care of things myself, so Nina must have been annoying him too. After a few minutes, Mrs. Kong came to me to ask Nina, are you doing okay, helping Iris? Yes, I think she's catching on, she answered. Catching on? I looked back down at my work so I wouldn't turn into one of those cartoon characters with steam shooting out of their ears. After I scribbled down the last answer in the word book, I slammed it closed and signed finished. I was about to take out my phone so I could read the new issue of Antique Radio magazine I downloaded that morning. If I opened a book on my desk, I could probably read some of the magazines by looking down at my phone on my lap. While my hand was sliding into my backpack, Mrs. Khan said something to me and pointed at her mouth. She tried that before, as if they could magically help me understand her. One night at dinner, I told my parents, hey, I'm not deaf anymore, and Mrs. Khan pointed to her lips while she talked, and everything was perfectly clear. Can't you believe you didn't think of that? On the first day of school, Mrs. Khan tried to hold Mr. Charles' hands still to force me to read her lips instead of watching his signing. I didn't catch with what Mr. Charles said to her, but she let go of his hands like she'd touched a hot stove and didn't try that ever again. We ignored the lip pointing and Mr. Charles interpreted what Mrs. Khan said. I've had to redo my poetry assignment from last week that didn't make sense. The poem I turned in was really good. When Mrs. Khan returned with my paper, she looked like she had just bitten into a sour pickle. A normal expression for her, but right then it looked like she was smelling something really bad at the same time she was biting that pickle. The red ink was the first thing I noticed when Mrs. Khan had handed my paper. In the margin were the words, "This does not rhyme," which wasn't true. The poem came from a sign language storytelling game I used to do with my grandpa. One of us would start a story and we would take turns adding to it, one sign at a time. The trick was our hands had to keep the same shape for the whole story. Like, if we started out with a closed fist, every sign of the rest of the story had to be with a closed fist. We'd go on like that until one of us couldn't think of something to add without breaking the hand-shaped rule. My favorite story started with a tree full with leaves. A leaf blew away with a gust of wind, then landed in a river, floated down a stream, and onto the blanket. Ended with a bird swooping in to grab the leaf to add her to the nest in another tree. We told her that the story with our hands opened like the number 5 the whole way through. I didn't look the same on paper. Paper is flat, so I couldn't use all the spaces above and below and around it that I needed to tell the story right. And the words in English don't have the same shapes and do in sign language. But here's how it looked when I wrote it. Wrote it down. Leaves waving, blowing, twirling, floating current, land on a riverbank. Mother's birds grabs a leaf and builds a new nest. Sure, it didn't rhyme the way English words do, but I thought maybe it would be okay to turn it in if I had explained it all. At the top of the paper, I had written a note about the poem. I wondered if Mrs. Conn had even read that part. A red line across through the poem running it. I took out my own red pen and glared at Mrs. Conn below her "This does not rhyme" message. I wrote, "It does to me. Ever since Grandpa died, I'd wonder if he could still see me, if he was with me in some way. Right then, I'd hoped more than anything. He was nowhere now here near me. I didn't want him to see what Mrs. Conn had done to our story. To us. Everyone turned and looked at me as I crumpled the paper into a ball. Nina had fingers to her lips, as always, like it was her job to remind me that things made noise and that I wasn't supposed to do any of them. But I did not throw the paper at her face. I flung it across the room, where it landed in the trash can, followed by the tree and the leaves and the river and the bird with her new nest, and all slashed to pieces by a red line. Chapter 3. Even though electronics is a sciencey thing, science was the one class where I wasn't reading about it on the slide. Usually I paid attention to what was going on in there because I like science, and my teacher, Sophia Almila, I even liked the way her name rolled off my hand, like wave when I spelled it out. Mrs. Almia wrote the letters HZ on the board. "Remember what that stands for?" she asked. A few hands went up, and Mrs. Almia called on me. I spelled out HERTZ, and Mr. Charles' voice of hurts. For her and all the class. "That's right," said Mrs. Almia. "And what does it measure?" "The frequency of sound." I wondered why Mrs. Almia was reviewing frequencies. We'd taken the test on it months ago. "I found something that ties it nicely with what we're studying now," she said, as if she had heard me. "It's about a special whale, and you have seen the frequencies of its song is important." Mrs. Almia pressed some keys on her computer at the desk. An eyeglass reflected the window and played. A projector screen in front of the room showed a big blue square with no symbol in one corner. I was heading to Mrs. Almia's desk please even before she signed, "Please help" to me after restarting the video, and paused it. I connected the computer to the projector signal, then clicked the CC at the bottom of the screen to turn on the closed captions. The video started out with a whale swimming in the ocean. Because the captions, I could read the words on the screen instead of from Mr. Charles' hands. The dark gray blue body of the whale filled up the room, his tail waving up and down. The narrator in the video talked about a whale called Blue 55 who swam around by itself and not in a pod like most whales. As far as anyone knew, it had always been that way. He didn't have any friends or family to swim with or talk to. He was a type of baleen whale, the kind that ate plankton and small fish, but not the kind with teeth that ate squid and seals. But he was a hybrid. His mother was a blue whale and his father was a fin whale. "The problem," said the narrator, "is Blue 55's unique voice. Most whales call out a frequency of 35 Hz and lower, while the lonely whale sound are at 55 Hz. Only about 20 Hz off. But it made a big difference. He was speaking a language that only he knew. Furthermore, his song is a unique pattern. Even if other whales can hear him, they don't understand what he is saying. Blue 55 likely couldn't communicate with his own parents." My stomach tightened into a ball. I wanted another whale on the screen to swim up to Blue 55, or at least look at him. The strange calls of Blue 55 were first detected by naval sonar in the late 1980s. Marine biologists figured out what was making the sounds and why the whale was all alone in the ocean. I didn't notice until the words on the screen blurred that my eyes were watering. Mr. Charles handed me a tissue from his pocket. Maybe I'd sniffled or something. Allergies, I sighed, without looking away from the video. The narrators went on to say that researchers from a marine sanctuary had tried to put a tracker on Blue 55 the year before so they could follow his migration patterns, which was also weird and unlike other whales. They did a sample of his skin to test that, how they figured out his parents had been different species before they could attach a tracker on him. He dove down and swam away. He wouldn't need to resurface for breathe for another 20 minutes without a tracker on him. The only way anyone ever knew where he was swimming from under the microphones that picked up his song. I didn't remember standing up, but when the video ended and Mrs. Amelia started talking, I had to look down to see Mr. Charles' eye. Everyone's eyes were on me. I slid back down into my chair, textbook on the floor. I must have knocked it off my desk. When I stood up, I left it at my feet. Can you imagine that? Mrs. Amelia asked. Swimming around for all those years and able to communicate with anyone? Yes. She said something else about frequencies, but I wasn't paying attention anymore. I looked through Mr. Charles as if I could still see that whale on the screen. Blue 55 didn't have a pod or friends or family who spoke his language, but he still sang. He was calling, and no one heard him. Well, that's going to be all for today on Reading Sisters. I was Naomi reading Song for a Whale, and I actually am very enjoying this book. And this is a book for 2020 to 2021 for the Sunshine State Books, grades 6 to grade 8. And yes, this is going to be a larger thing we are going to do on our channel. We are probably going to continue doing digital books if that was one of the questions you had in mind. But before you click off this video, I would like you to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell if you really, really, really enjoyed this book and want to hear more. That lets us know that you like our digital books. And yeah, so this was Naomi reading Song of a Whale to you.